So I think we're going to get underway. Welcome everybody to an evening I've been looking forward to ever since two speakers agreed to do it, and it fits exactly into the mentality of the Monday night so-called debates, but even debate implies something a little bit too strong. It's more like Monday nights are about questions and Wednesday nights are about answers. So Wednesday tends to be unbelievably self-assured architects displaying the glories of their own personality and work. And Mondays tend to be always more than one person really thinking through questions. Two extraordinarily accomplished people, you know a lot about them already, but just to sort of point out the obvious reasons why they're sitting together tonight. Gwen Wright, one of the great teachers in the school and historians in the field, who from the very beginning of her academic career has not been easily pinned down to one subject or field, and you could name just a number of areas that she's covered, almost each one of which is marked by a very substantial book in the classic form of scholarship. But more recently, maybe since 2003 or so, has been one of the protagonists in the History Detectives, in which suddenly it's not just shifting fields within the academic environment, but actually shifting beyond the academic environment into a wider world of public discourse, and also sort of engaging directly with the connections between history, as it's done very well, and the kinds of questions that are asked by the people that in theory we serve but so easily neglect. And of course Michael Kimmelman is like equally impossible to describe, whether it be as of course as a critic, probably to this room most well known as the architecture critic of the New York Times, but in an earlier moment I think the art critic of the New York Times, in another moment kind of foreign correspondent. He pops up all over the world raising all sorts of questions, has written considerably more about architecture than the people who were unaware that he would become the architecture critic realized, a very substantial record of publications. But also, and having in common with Gwen, a very, very strong sense of kind of, again, these words are too clumsy, but a kind of a concern for social responsibility written into all of the writing and all of the work, and in Michael's case, even into the music, as a very accomplished musician. So the reason that these two people are, of course, so delightfully paired together is that they don't really sit in anybody else's categories, but they have in common a kind of ongoing project to try to understand the meaning of discussing the kinds of things that we would normally talk about in this room, but discussing in the widest possible media context, whether it be television, and again, I think Michael has also a long track record in television, and to say the very least, television, which may or may not be going the way of newspapers, if we can say that, has never really been thought about seriously by the architectural field, despite the fact that surely the arrival and dominance of television as a mass medium for quite some decades fundamentally reorganized the nature of the personal experience of social life and so on, inseparable, of course, in the case of America, from the suburbs themselves, and the sort of deterritorialization of the American city made possible also by the apparent reconnection to social life through television, which of course didn't really offer what it promised. But the fact that our field never really even thought about it in any great detail indicates our enormous capacity to be neglectful of what it means to think about architecture and space and art in a wider public context. A fact that is borderline alarming or absurd if you consider that we still regard ourselves as the public art. So in that sense, just a word of welcome to two wonderful people who we're very lucky have agreed to sit together to discuss their work, and I think to talk with you about the kinds of questions, what it means for them to be staging exactly the same kind of questions that we ask in here, but stage them differently for a much wider and ultimately perhaps more serious audience. So welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Indeed, this won't be a debate, because I think that Michael and I have discovered that we agree about most things. and therefore really want to have this be some preliminary presentation about how each one of us came to find opportunities and are trying to push those opportunities even farther in terms of having an exchange, not only presenting ideas about the arts and architecture to the public, but getting beyond that notion of speaking down, of informing the public, and instead actually going through a debate about the title for this, because the first title that was proposed is Who's Talking, and we thought it was perhaps important to say who's listening. And therefore, to ask a question for all of us here, how do we try to get beyond the constraints, the necessary exchanges that we'll have with people in our profession, with people in our educational group, with people who come from our background, with people who live in New York and whose kids go to the same schools and who are therefore in a world that we benefit from, but it does inevitably restrict us. Now, from the time that I was a student, I was committed, but also by necessity, had to try to reach beyond the field of first architectural history and then architecture. I actually, at one point, supported myself by writing a column under the name of Joyce Brothers called The Psychology Behind the News. And it was a matter of trying to think through at that early point, in 21 years old, what kinds of issues were there that one could raise about events in the world. Now, I was intrigued by trying to do that in two ways. How could I take ideas about history and about architecture to a broad public, but also how could I take the kinds of concerns that people have, the kinds of desires they have about their housing. There's been a lot of discussion, and it's understandable, about how foolish it is that people want certain kinds of suburban homes. I would like for us to find ways to ask, what are those concerns? What are those desires? How can we find new ways of interpreting them, perhaps? But how do we try to listen more effectively? Now, that means expanding the audience of people here, and I'm actually pleased to see that there are people here. This is not simply a school of architecture, but it's one of architecture and planning and preservation and real estate development and curatorial explorations. We need to keep reminding ourselves of those multiple conversations, but also, I think, for the two of us, to engage the educated audience of the New York Times and the people who watch PBS, but to try to expand those. And our editors, of course, want us to expand those because they want to increase readership. But it's an intriguing challenge because it means you have to think differently about your language, but also about how you speak. Now, one of the points that really pleased me about History Detectives was after about 3 years, I discovered it was a much larger audience than I had thought. I got an email one morning from a friend who, Mary McLeod, knows Leonard Barkin, who holds a chair in Renaissance history and literature at Princeton, who said, I just have to tell you, I love this show. It shows how we do history. And that afternoon, I was walking down the street, and an 18-wheel truck drove by, and the truck driver leaned out the window and said, hey, History Detective, I love your show. So I thought, hey, this is what we always try to do, of reaching this broad audience. And that person feels like I'm not talking down to him. And so it got me to think a lot and to actually talk to my colleagues. These are questions I'd like to raise here. How do we get across information? How do we talk about interpretations without seeming to be talking down? Now, the format of the program is actually quite straightforward. That somebody comes in, usually a viewer. We get about 1,000 people a year, most of whom have ridiculous things. My Aunt Gertrude disappeared, can you find her for me? But others will say, well, why did these archaeologists discover a skeleton crammed in the back of a 17th century house in what was the Virginia colony? Or was this house that was close to Salem part of the Salem witchcraft trials? Or was the land that belonged to my family once a Nazi POW camp? And so we take that object, and the specificity of the object or the building lets us look at 10 different things. And nobody ever seems to get confused. So you can look at the Geneva Conventions, and you can look at rural Texas, and you look at what actually happened in this place and a murder that took place. And people don't get confused because of the specificity and the materiality of the thing. And so in doing that, we show people how you do an investigation. The main thing, again, for all of us is how do you look really closely? How do you look at an object? How do you walk around in a building? How do you actually begin to measure things? How do you notice materials and changes over time? How do you look at a site? Things that even all of us, it's often hard to get students, because they're so deluged with images, to sit with one for a long time. And the second one is, how do you use archives? How do you examine evidence? How do you look for and find a way to cope with the inevitably conflicting evidence? One newspaper says one thing happened, another newspaper says another happened. You'll have people you'll interview and they'll have different points of view. So it's to bring that forward as the inevitability of doing history, as opposed to this guy is right and that guy's lying, and which of course is a major problem today. And then the third part is dealing with that and taking up this question of interpretations, but also having the interpretations be a challenge to ourselves. I often try, even rhetorically, to say, it's just very confusing, or that gives me a different idea about what so-and-so said the other day. And so it's to try to open up the need to question your own first assumption, because we all do this. You get an idea about what happened and why, and then you look for ways to prove it. And so the show tries to give a sense of of this process of investigation, expanding that investigation, but of questioning our own points of view as well as juxtaposing other people's. Now, I think it's germane, even though we only occasionally get to have stories about architecture, but it's germane for architects because it is about this process of exploring different points of view and about learning, really pushing ourselves to learn from, or at least take account of other people's opinions and not just trying to instruct them about our own. We obviously all have wonderful, important things to tell people about architecture, but most people don't like being lectured to. And so I think one of the ways that a critic and a person on a show like this, but all of us can learn how to open up that conversation, is having people feel that we're listening to them and therefore that they can put their ideas forward. Now, I think it's also very close to what we're now calling research. That is, whether it's in preservation or in planning or in architecture, how can we explore historical investigations and bring up different points of view? So it's not this one set of things happen, because very often we've all seen this in juries and presentations. There'll be one history as opposed to juxtaposing several. How do we try to bring up these different experiences and deal with, find some way of responding to and balancing, not necessarily resolving, but responding to those differences? How do we open up a topic and then come back 6 months later or a year later to see what we can learn from what's happened, to see what we missed the first time around, and not just to try to defend our proposal? It's understandable that as professionals and as human beings, we'd want to defend ourselves. This is not in any ways a challenge to that, but I think it becomes really important to try to hone those as critical skills, especially in a world that becomes more and more fragmented. Now, we discovered this the hard way, as is often the case, because we started getting a little too editorial and trying to explain to the audience what we thought were important lessons, what I early on called the so what factor about the stories. That here you have a story, an investigation, but what's really interesting are questions about gender or questions about the government lying to the people or things like this. And this was the one actually about the Nazi POW camp. And thousands of people wrote in and said about a little statement that I made about the Geneva Conventions and Guantanamo, and said, you have no right to tell us what to think about this. And we stopped and had a long discussion and decided that to a certain extent, we should take that and make something of it. Rather than telling people what they ought to think, we should give them evidence. We should give them a sense of several interpretations. And we should prompt them to say, you know, that's just like X. And then they would have actually learned something. So it becomes, I think, a really important challenge, both pedagogy within the school for those of us who teach and for the ways that students are always teaching each other, and for the ways that we work with the people who live in places where there are projects, and then later on the clients that we have. It's a hard skill to develop, and we're doing it in a school where there's so many skills people are learning. But to my mind, John Dewey actually put it very well a century ago when he was talking about the law. And he said that only certain men and women who are trained are able to write laws, but everyone has the right to judge laws. And so the experience that I've had in this program, and I'll show you a little piece of how it works, but I think there are some strategies, at least, for thinking about opening up that discussion. Now, Michael Kimmelman takes this kind of conversation in a very direct way in the work that he's doing with the New York Times, because he's taking up issues not only about architecture, but about the city. And I think this is where the questions about transportation, infrastructure, bicycles, and Penn Station, about open space and greenery, about housing, become absolutely crucial. So I'm really eager to hear how you define this challenge of trying to both speak to and listen to the public. Why don't you come up and give us some of your thoughts?
Hi, thanks, Gwen. I'd love to pick up on these thoughts when we begin to chat, and I'm happy to talk about any of those issues specifically. I thought it might be just useful, as I was listening to you, to tell you a little bit about how I ended up doing what I do. And there's a reason why this relates to, I think, the ways in which I think it's useful to communicate. I grew up down in the village, and my dad was a surgeon, but he was this very politically active guy, an old commie, and so my house in the village was this kind of Penn Station for visiting dignitaries of the left. You know, Gus Hall used to come by for dinner constantly, an appalling man. You know, Angela Davis was there, and Isabella Allende. All these people would come in and out of the house, and I would sort of trundle out in my Batman pajamas and listen to some of these conversations. And my father was a diligent reader of the New York Times, among many other things. And I remember him vividly sort of underlining the Times and ripping out articles and putting them aside, because he was completely convinced, as are my other relatives now in the village, who, by the way, are constantly in the front of the community board 2 meetings in the village now opposing development down there. And he was always underlining and doing these things because for him the Times was clearly a puppet of the CIA, and so he felt that he could, you know, get a line on what was actually going on behind the scenes if he could read behind the lines, as it were, of the New York Times. So you fast forward a little bit, I ended up going to school at the university, and I was a very serious student, and I got very interested in history, but I had been trained as a pianist, so I was very interested in cultural history, and in issues of, I think, in issues of social and political content in culture. And this was an outgrowth of I think, the upbringing that I had. And I wanted to somehow marry issues of culture with issues of politics and social affairs. So I went to graduate school and began to, and did art history, because at that time, I was an undergraduate at Yale and I was a graduate student at Harvard, and at that time, there was, those of you who know art history, there was a guy named Tim Clark, who was then just at Harvard. It was a very tumultuous time at the Fog, but it was a very interesting moment. So I began to think that maybe an academic path was the right one, and I was very focused on this kind of notion of a social art history. I went there, by the way, with an intention possibly of doing architectural history as well, because I worked for a while as an editor at ID magazine between school. It was a great experience, and I won't bore you with it now, but it laid the groundwork essentially for a journalistic career. And then I began to feel uncomfortable as a graduate student, because I think what I had seen from my father, that's why I mention it, was an urgency to the notion of a public discourse. That for all of the lunacy of the Times being run by the CIA, and for all the craziness of the, what I was reading in the Daily Worker every day and all the other journals that came through the House, there was nonetheless this idea that what was written, that the kinds of conversations and writing that took place in journals in this public sphere really mattered. I mean, he was circling and underlining these things, and he cared. By the way, he was a wonderful, dear man, and very bright. So I don't mean to make him seem like one of these crazy people, But I think that urgency was something I worried about in academia, and I mention it in art history because I think, having moved around in areas a bit, I think it's applicable in architecture, as it is in other areas as well, musicology and literature. So I longed for a way in which I longed for a place in which to carry out a serious public conversation with serious people. I thought that there was a moral component to this, that this was actually why one went into these fields and what one was supposed to do as a writer. And so I ended up gravitating to newspaper work and lucked out and got a job at the New York Times. I wanted to pick up on something Gwen said as well, because then the question becomes, well, how do you develop a voice that's useful, and useful in several senses, that's entertaining, because you want people to want to read you, and informative, that is, you're passing along information, and hopefully has a voice and a quality of itself and to itself, and also an opinion that is identifiably yours. Developing that voice is complicated, and one of the key things for me, because I really started at the Times mostly doing art writing. I became an art critic there by chance, as it were, was to focus on writing about objects of art. And Gwen mentioned the specificity of her series and the way in which dealing with specific objects grounds information and knowledge. And this was really crucial also as a writer. I think, we often become disconnected when we're in our fields, and in specialized fields and in the academic world. Often we become absorbed in theoretical issues and in abstractions and in the communication between and among colleagues. But the bridge, really, I think, to a larger audience is in the specific, in things that are grounded in the real world. And the complication of really describing in a way that was clear to me, that represented what I thought and that was explicable, understandable, of a painting, let's say, or an object. This was very complex. It was much harder than I feared it would be, and it wasn't training that I had gotten in graduate school. It really wasn't. I was educating myself in public at the Times. And it was a long, complicated process. And then, I made an idiot of myself for many years as I learned it. But the other thing I gradually came to realize, it wasn't really discovery so much as a tool I came to use, was that it wasn't just my encounter with this object, but the world around this object and other people's interactions with this object, including the makers of them, but also the users of them, that illuminated and gave perspective to this discussion. So I began to realize, it sounds like it's obvious, but it isn't necessarily, because we all become focused, and critics often will just say, go out and review something, as if it exists in some vacuum. But I began to realize that it was an opportunity that I had as a writer and a journalist to go out and interview people, to do profiles of people, to ask questions about how these objects existed in the world. I had drifted away to some extent from my original desire, which was to really write about real-world affairs. And I won't bore you with this here, but I became tired of the art world for reasons that had to do with this, and spent time in Europe trying to invent, essentially, for myself, a way of reconnecting issues of culture to issues of politics and social affairs. But I think for me, the key and crucial, the embedded gift of writing about architecture is that it is the form that is, it is the issue at the heart of how we live. I think it is about how we live. And it raises all of the kinds of questions which, you know, my father was asking, and everyone in the world really cares about. And this is why, for me, the idea of becoming the architecture critic and writing about neighborhoods and infrastructure and public space and so forth required absolutely no leap of imagination. It seems to me that this is exactly what we're all doing here. It is the thing that people care about, how they live. And the great opportunity of architecture is you get to talk to people in buildings and ask them how they like those buildings, in neighborhoods and ask them how they feel about these neighborhoods, to talk to politicians who can shape these affairs, and designers and architects, planners and others who also contribute to this. This conversation is the conversation about how we form a society. So it seems to me that this issue really of the role of a critic in relation to a public is relatively easy to solve in the case of architecture. I suppose the question that one has to ask within the profession is how you get other people to hear what you're saying. And the lesson to be learned from, I think, the journalist's experience is that you need to just listen. I mean, you know, the idea of communicating to your colleagues is very important. But I also think that finding a way to describe things that are understandable to people who are intelligent but may not be specialists in a field, which is really what you wish to do at the Times. You need to write for both specialists and other people who are smarter than you are, but may not have the specific knowledge about an issue that you do. That's the process of persuasion and communication. That's where this public debate that I kind of envisioned my father desiring. I think that's where it takes place. I can't help but add that. So I went to work at the Times, you know, and my father was not well in his last years, but there I was in the belly of the beast, and I remember very clearly, you know, he was really ailing just before he died, and he wasn't so clear about things, and he said, you know, I think the Times, he was talking about its editorial policy, right? But he said, I think the Times has gotten a little bit better. So I thought something got accomplished in that. Anyway, we can talk about whatever, but that was just, I hope you don't mind my sharing a slightly personal intro. Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
We're actually going to show you, just to give a sense of these visual components and human components, two little segments. One is a piece from History Detectives that's about architecture. Unfortunately, it wasn't cut the right way. That they were supposed to cut it back, but they both missed.
10 million.
Just 1 second.
10 million.
And then cut and have too much at the start. But it's about 10 minutes long. But take a look, and then we'll just go right into a segment of an interview that Michael had with Amanda Burden in the South Bronx. Okay? Okay, go ahead.
American servicemen and women came home at the close of World War II, eager to turn their energies from fighting to building a modern post-war nation. An emerging network of interstate highways would encourage a new scale of housing in large new suburbs, places like Levittown, New York, where the company's factory produced one 4-room house every 16 minutes in 1950. But the building boom takes a while. The Depression, followed by the war years, had left the nation with a critical housing shortage. Where would the army of returning GIs live? Now the Strathorns of Lakewood, Colorado, have made a discovery which may offer a unique look at how necessity became the mother of invention in post-war America.
here we are.
Well, this certainly isn't your usual basement rafter, is it?
No, that's what we thought when we first looked at the house.
It is amazing. This is several hundred pounds of steel looking at you, and there's another one at the other end.
So when did you first see this?
Well, we came one afternoon to look at the house and immediately noticed this because I'm basically a railroad buff.
Kathy and Bill believe that the beam is the undercarriage of a railroad car. The deed says their house was built in 1949.
Neighborhood.
Bill has a plan of the neighborhood, known as Daniel's Gardens. It's dated 1939. These beams certainly look like the undercarriage of some kind of train car.
Well, measurements are useful. I get my tape measure. 8 feet.
I'm not sure, but this seems a little narrow for a railroad car. In any case, this isn't a fashion statement about the beauty of industrial objects. It's a real piece of equipment that's holding up the house.
Well, it seems to be covered with grease and dirt, as if it was taken right off the tracks and put down on this lot. Well, this must be the edge of the undercarriage. Huh, look at that. Only.
The undercarriage is directly below the kitchen.
There's no indication that there was once any kind of train car right here, or that there's an undercarriage of a train right below my feet.
It's clearly recent, although the facade evokes American architecture of a century ago.
A mix of shingle style and craftsman style American houses.
Bill told me the house had undergone renovations. I wonder what it looked like before.
Let's take a look at this map now. So, Daniel's Garden Edition, 1939. These lots are very narrow and quite deep, and this depth may be suggesting that people had small vegetable and even fruit farms in the back. And here's our plot right here, 21. Oh, look at this. No lot or tract may be used for fox, mink, skunk, or hog farms, dog kennels, junkyards, or salvage places. This seems like it could have been a working-class neighborhood. And here we have Leonard Zoll, owner and subdivider. So who was Leonard Zoll?
I want to learn more about the early residents of Daniel's Gardens. I've arranged for a tour with Katie Thorsheim. She's co-author of 50 Cents Down, a history of this neighborhood.
So who was Leonard Zoll who did this?
He was a Turkish immigrant. We believe he came from Detroit. He followed a fairly common model of the time, which was to divide the land in little pieces, hold the title, and sell them to people who would then build.
Katie says the map is Zoll's original site plan. The land is just 10 miles from downtown Denver. Zoll bought it in 1938, laid out the plots, and priced them to sell.
He had a big billboard on Colfax right up here, and a little tin shack under it, and on the billboard was a hen and a bunch of chicks, and it said 50 cents down, 50 cents a week.
That's 50 cents a week, 11 and a half years for a $300 lot, plus the cost of building a house. The economy had improved, but money was still tight. This was a high-risk deal for the early residents.
If you didn't pay the money, Zoll was knocking on your door. If you didn't have it, you're out of there.
Even if you had built part of a house or a whole house on there, he would get the whole thing and could sell
The whole
it again,
thing
right?
back, yes.
Who came to live here?
Almost every single one of them was the child of a homesteader. They had helped their family establish something, usually in the Eastern Plains where the Dust Bowl came.
Katie tells me that Leonard Zoll got lucky in 1941. Daniel's Gardens residents who worked in factories retained their rural roots, planting gardens and raising livestock. That's still happening today.
Now, I'm sure that most of these houses have changed a lot since they were originally built, but how were they first put together?
Well, you're starting with bare land, so you started with a little square house.
Katie's description of a nearby freight track that serviced the munitions plant has caught my attention. Was our house built from one of those rail cars?
You heard of anything like that?
Katie explains that farming roots and Depression-era frugality meant Daniel's Gardens residents were creative builders who made the most of ad hoc recycled materials. But she's not familiar with our house.
You were trying to avoid spending too much money. The preferred material was packing crates or recycled wood. There were a lot of little kids that spent their lives pulling nails for their dads. If the materials were available, you'd make a house that worked around those materials. If somebody had a shed, glom it on.
I'm meeting Sarah Jo Peterson, an expert on what she calls urban homesteading. Sarah Jo explains how working-class neighborhoods just outside large cities expanded during the national housing shortage.
I brought this to show you really the severity of what was going on. This is a chart of new housing, starting in 25 and then ending with our house in 49.
The government restricted home building during World War II. 4 years after the end of the war, the private sector still wasn't building enough homes.
This is the beginning of the baby boom. These GIs are coming home, they get married, and they have babies right away.
That's right. And they want to have places of their own, and they just aren't available. And they're living in their parents' garages, and they're doubling up with their younger brothers. And what the country needs to do is build a lot of housing, a lot of affordable housing, fast.
The eventual response to the crisis would be mass suburbia, planned communities that took advantage of industrial building materials and standardized designs. The 1949 Housing Act helped launch these large-scale suburbs. One of the first, known as Levittown, was built by William J. Levitt and Sons in Long Island, New York. Neighborhoods like Daniel's Gardens, where people built their own houses out of unconventional materials, were also common.
Today, we think that a builder builds a house, and then you get a mortgage, and the house is all done, and you pay for it over time. They instead built the house over time as they could afford it.
My office has put me in touch with Flint Schmeickel, the previous owner of our house.
Nice to meet you too. We bought it September 14th, 2001. These are pictures of the original structure when we first bought it. This is basically a rectangular house, and there was a boxcar that was basically half the house, running lengthwise.
When Flint began remodeling, the entire structure attached to Kathy and Bill's basement ceiling became visible.
This is looking down through the old rafters onto the roof of the train car, and you can see that this is the whole train car running right along the side of the walls, which was our kitchen and a small bedroom.
So this was the ceiling of the train car here?
Yes.
So you did this major expansion?
Yep. I completely remodeled the whole house with adding a 2-car garage and a second story and tearing off the old roof.
Flint thinks that the kitchen once housed a different kind of eating establishment, a dining car from a passenger train.
You can see here that the walls were kind of arched. Ours had these special wood beams and windows on the end of it to make it a special dining car.
But something bothers me here.
Thanks a lot.
Flint thinks our railroad car was originally part of the line that serviced the nearby munitions plant. But why would a dining car have been running on a freight line? Colorado Railroad Museum archivist Kent Forrest has agreed to meet me at the house.
Thanks for coming out here. Let's go inside.
Okay.
It's in here, Kent. Let me show you. Now, this does seem to me to be the undercarriage of some kind of train car.
Right. We can tell by this thing here, which is called a bolster. And this is what held the wheels to the car.
Now, would the proportions or the size of these give you an information?
From this width, I can tell it's a narrow gauge car.
But he's not certain the basement structure was ever a railroad car. He spots the word only, which prompts him to show me something in the museum's archive. The curious stenciling in Bill and Kathy's basement has given Ken our answer.
Exit only. Is that our only sign?
I believe so.
Let me get it out. Let's see. Oh, it is the same typeface. Only and only.
In Denver, as in other American cities, horse-drawn railways provided the earliest public transportation. Then, from the turn of the century until the 1950s, a network of electric trolley cars replaced the horse cars, crisscrossing downtown areas and pushing suburban growth outside the city limits.
So what happened to these trolley cars?
Right after the Second World War, they started getting rid of routes and replacing them with buses, which at that time was the modern thing to do.
I explained that the story of their house begins with the demise of the Denver trolley car system, just after World War II.
So what happened to these trolley cars?
After they converted to buses, they sold them for scrap or they sold them to people.
How much did they sell them for?
Well, just happen to have a little piece of newspaper here for you.
Ah, look at that.
Here they're selling them for $100.
So they were $100. Look at this. For summer cabins, grain storage, trout hatcheries, playhouses, waiting rooms, etc.
Right.
Were there other houses that you know of?
Oh yeah, now here, this is the company magazine, Tramp Topics, in 1950. And here is a picture of a Denver streetcar, and they added a little porch in the front, put some screen windows in, And you can see they're all just sitting around here enjoying the summer breeze. And then here is one where they put two together, and this made a chapel.
$100.
Oh my, look
A
at
lot
that.
cheaper than a house.
I'll be darned. That really is neat.
Your house is fascinating. It also connects us to a much bigger story. At the very time that this rapid transit system was being dismantled, cities like Denver committed themselves entirely to building new roads and highways. And here's a report from the Denver Planning Office of their vision for those new highways. 6-lane highways with cloverleaf intersections, the highways we know today.
And that's right out here, Federal Boulevard to Clear Creek Canyon.
Your house has quite a story.
After 1950, suburbs grew an average of 10 times faster than cities. The new mass suburbs changed the landscape of American society. Unlike cities, almost everyone here looked alike. Young white couples with little children. Earlier suburbs always had some form of public transit, but now suburban homeowners needed their own cars to get to work. To accommodate the new cars and expand new outlying neighborhoods, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, paving the way for more suburbs further and further outside cities.
Enterprising home builders have always repurposed existing materials, but environmentalists have given resource reclamation new urgency. As construction industry waste approaches 136 million tons a year, green builders are promoting what they call
We're in the South Bronx, and you know what people have thought about the South Bronx for decades? This is an area that was burned out. This is not that South Bronx.
This is Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times. More than a dozen housing projects in the last decade have transformed the Melrose section of the South Bronx. I took a walk with Amanda Burden, director of the Department of City Planning, to survey some of the changes.
It is a typical New York street.
There was a time when, of course, after the Bronx burned, people felt no one would live here again. And the question was, how do you build houses? How do you reconstruct a neighborhood? So what happened in the beginning?
I remember Jimmy Carter coming up here and thinking the only thing you could build here that might sell would be a ranch house. And that evolved to a development just across the street in 1993 called Melrose Court. And what was thought could be bought at that time was home ownership, but very low density. But that changed in the 90s, the emergence of an incredible neighborhood advocacy group called Nos Quedamos. It was led by Yolanda Garcia, and she had a vision for this neighborhood, that it was going to be a neighborhood that was dense, with buildings that were built to the street wall, tree-lined streets.
We're now standing in front of the newest project, I suppose, to open that you've been involved in, St. Anne's, right behind us. And it's an example, I suppose, of the result of this kind of thinking.
So what's important about St. Anne's? It has large retail stores, lots of glass at the ground level. It's built to meet the street line. Street trees are required to be planted. This building happens to be all rentals, but what we'll see on this walk is many examples of affordable home ownership. Now that's sort of an oxymoron, right? Because if it's going to be home ownership, you want to make a profit. So what we do in affordable home ownership is limit the amount of profit you can make.
So it's a difficult thing to get retailers, supermarkets, grocers, and other kind of retailers in here, yeah?
Until you get the density of people actually moving in, retailers will be cautious about committing to a lease until they see that level of density. So the density is not only about having vibrant streets, it's also about having neighborhood stores occupied.
So, Amanda, this is Via Verde.
So Via Verde combines so many different elements. Affordable home ownership, affordable rentals, international design competition, green urban living, community gardens. This says it all, and density.
They're building the South Bronx as we stand here.
Mayor Bloomberg put together the most aggressive affordable housing program in the nation. It's at least a $3 billion endowment for this housing with a goal of 165,000 units over the course of his administration, and he's at least 35% in achieving that goal. You know, there's some neighborhoods that don't want a Duane Reade, but when you see a Duane Reade coming to a neighborhood like this, here at 163rd Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx, that means this neighborhood has arrived. This is a equal housing, and there are 8 components of this development, 8 buildings that are all extremely affordable, and including the new Lakewood College, which is a tall glass building which we'll actually see around the corner. And the real challenge here on this gigantic site is really how do you give it street wall, character, diversity, and break it up, not in one building, that was the original proposal, but in 8 separate buildings, and significant public open space, which is just being constructed now.
I also noticed that either because they were holdouts or because the community asked, there are some of the very old buildings that have remained within this kind of super block, and actually, oddly, it adds to the diversity of the architecture of the streets.
I think totally.
So, Amanda, this is 161st Street. It ends in Yankee Stadium.
Well, I think this is actually the most extraordinary change, transformation. There are about 1,000 apartments here in 6 or 7 different buildings
In the next
on on 161st Street. So that this is a whole revitalized spine of the South Bronx.
One of the questions, of course, everybody will say is, well, you're building all this housing, but housing is not jobs.
Housing is jobs. Housing is for the construction industry. Housing is bringing people to the city. We have hundreds of thousands of people who come here each year. And they're coming to fulfill their dream. They're coming here to climb the ladder. They need a place to live. They need a place to live that's affordable. It's here. It's here in the South Bronx.
Yeah,
This thing?
that piece, that video piece.
Oh, that's just on the Times website.
So that's
Yeah.
something that, that people can go on the website, if they,
Yeah.
they look up housing South Bronx. a range of
You
different
go into the
topics.
video thing, and I don't know how many people. You know, it's an interesting thing about video on the Times because I thought, oh, this is something I wanted to find different forms in which to expand the purview of the job, and I thought I started tweeting, and I thought we could have some sort of blog site or some page which could be a kind of open forum. It turns out to be almost impossible to construct at the Times. And in fact, when I wrote about Via Verde at first, I announced that we would be doing this, and we still haven't done it because apparently it's very difficult to maintain these sites, and they tend to be taken over by crazy people. And I imagine I would write something, and then people would just use it as a forum, and I would come in there occasionally and whatever. But apparently this is very difficult. But I try to open it up for comments, the articles and things like that. And then I thought video would be good. So I wanted to do something. And as soon as Amanda learned I was writing about Via Verde, she immediately was anxious to take me up on the offer to go around the South Bronx because Via Verde is not one of the city projects, but a private project. And I was, I think it's an effective way to expand what the paper does. Just FYI, I didn't know this myself really, but I thought video would be seen by lots of people. Because when I lived in Berlin, I would watch all these Times videos, because you're sitting at home. My office in Berlin, it was easy to do. But actually, they're seen by many fewer people than look at the photographic, the stuff, and just and the reason is because I guess people sit in their offices and they can't play videos. So it was very disappointing. I thought this was my new career as a little video guy. Also, the one other little footnote I'll add to this is, so the reason I said they're building the South Bronx as we're here is because we wanted to get Via Verde. We stood on this corner and there were all these trucks, and there was no silence. So, of course, if you are a commissioner of the City of New York, you can finally walk to the guy who's the foreman of the project, and I saw Amanda walk into the street and whisper something in his ear, and he suddenly said, "Stop," like this. All the trucks stopped, and until that one who hadn't heard the order was very funny.
Well, it's too bad that it's hard to get that kind of dispersed viewership, because there is something exciting about sensing the city around it, and by seeing the different projects together. How would you think about the kinds of responses that you've gotten to the piece about Via Verde that you did, which was, I think, very widely disseminated, and other projects about housing?
Yeah. You know, I've been very heartened and thrilled by the response generally, overwhelmingly actually. You know, what I said before. Look, my job was started, you know, in the '60s by Ada Louise Huxtable, and you know, I think she was just a model, remains the model, and that's because I think when she created the job, it was a job that, in a sense, was a public policy position. It happened to exist in the arts pages, but it wasn't perceived as being an arts or entertainment thing. But she was writing about the city and buildings and urban affairs. It seems embedded in the job. So I think some of the response to Via Verde was simply that there is a natural, it wasn't a creative leap for me, it was just a natural thing to presume that there is an interest in issues like housing, and that architecture is about housing. And so many people here and elsewhere, of course, are involved profoundly in planning and in housing issues. So I think it was just awakening a community to that had been out there but hadn't been tapped, as it were, by the writing that we had tended to be doing.
Well, I think it's striking to go back to Ada Louise, who was the architecture critic and was indeed the person who established that role from '63 to '82 for 20 years. And she, like you, took a very strong position that she was writing about cities, how they happen, what are the conflicts between different groups and different kinds of individuals, who are the people who we should become critical of. She dared to be critical of. We probably remember her less for the architectural criticism than for the insistence that architecture is part of a larger urban phenomenon. And that seems to be one of the ways you're defining yourself. What do you see as the differences between writing about architecture and writing about the larger urban environment?
Well, I mean, I hesitate to draw any distinction. I mean, you know, buildings, I think there's a false dichotomy that's slightly been set up in these very early days of my doing this, which is not what I feel, and that is that there's this idea of writing about urban affairs and public policy issues and all this kind of stuff, housing issues and so forth, and architecture, by which I think people may presume that this thing over here is, you know, the latest building by Zaha Hadid or Renzo Piano or something, that there's this, you know, A-list architecture, and that's precluded from the mutually exclusive. I think they exist in the exact same world, but I do feel that, and I'm quite interested in this. You know, it's for me it's slightly odd that the little bit of tiny bit of blowback I feel is from people who say, well, is he going to actually write about, you know, architecture? Yeah, and you know, of course, when this job was announced, everyone thought, well, he's not an architect, and B, you know, having come from the art world, he's just going to write about buildings, architecture as buildings as baubles, this kind of thing. And now it's like, isn't he going to write about a building? Is it just an object? I mean, so I don't see a distinction, but I would say that I do think it's incumbent upon me and critics generally to look at buildings not just as formal objects and not just in their material inventions, but you know, how people use them, who uses them, their place in the economy. A tiny example I'll give you is, I mean, this seems to me so obvious that maybe it sounds stupid to even say. But anyway, I was going to say as a tiny example, you know, I spent a lot of time in Rome in the last few years, and Hadid's Maxi museum opened there. I'm thinking of going back and writing about it. Obviously, there are many different ways one can write about it. But, you know, I think as a critic, for me, what's interesting is to say, well, does it work? I mean, and does it work on many levels? What was its brief? It was to change the nature of a neighborhood, to reposition Rome's cultural identity and the identity of that neighborhood, to invigorate the streetscape there, to create a symbolic, Bilbao-like, Geary-like building there, to provide space for the exhibition of contemporary art and other kinds of events. Yeah, it's a museum. How does it work? Is it doing any of those things, or is it just this thing that, you know, has lots of curves and is in an old neighborhood where there were, you know, army barracks? And by the way, I don't know how many of you know that building. There are lots of problems with that building. I mean, huge problems with that building and how it works and whether it is in fact doing any of the things for which it was intended. There are also some good things about it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I mean, it seems to me that therefore writing about that building, one way one can do it is to go back now and say, what kind of a building is it? What does it look like? How does it work? What was its purposes? So forth.
Well, I totally agree. And I've faced many of the same things in the course of my career. People will often say, well, are you doing architectural history or are you doing social history? As if you had to choose, and that always struck me as being a ridiculous idea. I don't see them mutually exclusive. But I don't either. But I think part of the challenge, both for a school but also for critics, is to keep showing that it's not the case. Yeah. That the decisions about the aesthetics, about the Maxi, about Via Verde, about all kinds of buildings, affect how a range of people respond to it, and then how that particular streetscape works. And it requires, again, the specificity of it, as opposed to having it falling into or letting ourselves fall into one kind of discourse or another. But that's a challenge, I think, to all of us here. Maybe, actually, I'm sure that there are questions people, you and I can keep talking forever, but why don't we open this up and see if there are specific questions that you have that any of you want to pose to Michael. If not, we have plenty we can keep talking about of language and what it is that he thinks would be good for architecture students to learn, etc. Are there questions? Yes?
I'm curious if the Melrose Project learned from the disaster that was the St. Louis project that was ultimately dynamited, because it seems like what they did is totally opposite to what the Melrose Project is. What you mentioned, the streetscape and the planning and such. Was there a learn? Did you actually learn from that, or did you have your own ideas when the Melrose Project was implemented?
You're talking about the Pruitt-Igoe buildings, of course, in St. Louis. It's funny because there's I don't know how many of you have seen this film that came out recently called Pruitt-Igoe Myth. It's not what I learned from this. I mean, obviously, the lessons of the the Tower and the Park disastrous housing projects have reshaped the way people think about recuperating neighborhoods like the South Bronx. And what Amanda said, I think, is pretty much now standard thinking, that you have to reestablish the street wall, have a certain amount of density, traffic on the street, eyes on the street, and retail on the street, and all this kind of stuff that was a problem in projects like Pruitt-Igoe. But one of the things that's interesting about Pruitt-Igoe, of course, to me, is that I think a lot of these projects are, well, let me step back and say, what interested me about the movie about Pruitt-Igoe that came out was that it wanted to stress that the roots of the failure of that project were, of course, not just architectural. The guy who made the film was not an architectural person, but had been struck that the descriptions of the failure were all traced to problems with the design. That elevator landings were between floors, and you had these huge super blocks and then these empty plazas and so forth. And he didn't believe that was the real reason for the failure of Pruitt-Igoe. And he went back and talked to a lot of the original residents and people who grew up there and discovered, what do you know, that many of them had very touching, warm memories of Pruitt-Igoe in the beginning, but that what happened there was, of course, an economic crisis, a crisis of racial discrimination, and just a huge social crisis that compounded and in many ways really created the architectural problems. The buildings deteriorated and so forth. So I give you this long answer because I think, yes, areas like the South Bronx now, which are really quite remarkable to walk through, considering what our image of them was years ago, they've been reshaped by the failures of those kind of projects. But that I think those projects also need to be looked at again. And some of these Tower in the Park projects, of course, are kind of wonderful. I mean, out in Coney Island, we may need to be talking about infill and doing retail and lots of other stuff in these rather desolate stretches where there's nothing on the street. But I'm looking now at the NYU proposal for the expansion along LaGuardia Place in the Village, and of course those 50s era, those giant Washington Square Village blocks with the big grass plaza in the middle, and the Silver Towers. These are towers and park projects as well, and they're obviously quite a long ways from Pruitt-Igoe.
Well, was Pruitt-Igoe elevator design on alternate floors a cost advantage? Because, and is that the only place it's ever been done in this country?
No, not at all. No, I mean, the problems with Pruitt-Igoe had, of course they were compounded by lots of things, but, and the architecture contributed in some ways to it, but it was really that, the building I lived in Berlin had elevator landings between floors. It was not a slum. I mean, this is just completely nuts,
In part, I think that the film, which is really worth trying to see, makes the point that it was, in fact, a very positive place when it began. And the people who lived there loved it. But there was not money coming from the federal government, that the legislation was done such that there was no money for maintenance and upkeep. And therefore, you began to have problems that were exacerbated and very quickly became worse and worse. And then there was a tendency to blame these problems on architecture, that there was actually one federal report that said that Le Corbusier is responsible for the disasters of American public housing. So it became, I think, a real split in that you had many architects refusing, rightly, to take the full onus for things that were going wrong in American cities, and then a critique of architecture because it's an easy thing to critique. And so it becomes important to see that the discussion that you were having with Amanda Burden about Melrose was about how it works, and the film was about how it worked and how it didn't work. And those are really crucial things to bring into our discussion, not only the good intentions, but what happens even over a very brief period of time.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think is that, there were failures of Pruitt-Igoe's design, but the key difference now, I think, and this relates to something that Gwen brought up too, is the evolution of what happened in the South Bronx grew out of community activism. So there was very much a grassroots, bottom-up process in which the community decided, because after all, the top-down process was Carter's, that was what she was saying, the vision. No one's going to want to live in the South Bronx. We'll build ranch houses, low density, and a few people will get home ownership, and maybe gradually there will be some reemergence of something there. But the people who stuck in the South Bronx, they said, no, this is not the way this community is going to be reborn. We need to have neighborhoods like you have in other parts of the city, dense neighborhoods with lots of retail and lots of people. So that was what was missing, I think, in a lot of planning in the 50s and 60s. After all, it's what Jane Jacobs was writing about. Ask people how they want to live, look at how they actually live, and out of that you can begin to decide what makes a community. So the change it doesn't mean Tower and the Park projects are ipso facto failures, of course. I mean, there are many successful examples. But I think the bottom-up process of listening to the community and trying to design around that's a very important, shall we say, advance.
Yes.
Actual expense of the project.
Yeah, well,
and also, don't you think that that something about Nicholas Grimshaw and I guess the other person was Ratner?
Yeah.
That some of their interests and a critique of what they did to the building is important.
It's true, of course, about maintenance, and this was one of the problems that for Rigo as well, of course, that there was no money to support the project, so they kept burdening the poor residents who were strained beyond their capacity by rents to have to pay more and more to maintain the building, so it wasn't maintained. Villa Verde, which you're talking about, not Melrose, but Villa Verde, is a very interesting model because it's a mix of rental and home ownership, and within a different price range, and it's and I forgot what the mix is, 70-30 or something like this, but you know, it has built into it a much more stable economy for the maintenance of the building, which is more complex too, because the building is more complex.
I'd like to mention that one of the architects of the demonizing of Pruitt-Igoe was Charles Jenks, who picked it up as a kind of political argument against modernism to promote postmodernism. And what followed from that was, to get back to your other story of the bauble versus the city, was a greater and greater focus among architects and among architectural critics, and therefore among the public, on the individual star building by the starchitect. And I'd like to ask you what you feel about that movement, which may have produced something like the Maxi, Zaha Hadid, and so on.
You're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or either of you.
You know, in a way, I think you're right. There's certainly the idea that there's this star architect phenomenon suddenly occurred in the last 10 years or something, or was, or is just this, you know, this recent generation. I think is not quite true. It's really more than this, I think. And why did many of these people emerge as stars? Because they were incredibly interesting architects doing incredibly interesting things. So, I mean, again, I resist this this opposition between sort of good, you know, moral, socially responsible discussion and star architects. But I do think that it's true that much of the complexity of architecture, which no doubt was a concern and is a concern to many, you know, celebrated architects, was evacuated from the public conversation. And so people came to believe that architecture was about something closer to sculpture. I think it impoverishes the discussion, impoverishes architecture to do that, and therefore that's my problem with it. It's not that I have some intrinsic problem with the idea that an architect develops a large reputation and people want to hire him or her, and you know. But I do think that it also creates the illusion that the architect alone, by simply designing a building, can bring about real urban and social change. I mean, again, the example of Bilbao is interesting to me because, or we could take the High Line. In both those cases, there has emerged this, I think, this notion that, you know, Geary's building opened and suddenly Bilbao was transformed into this modern touristic capital. But of course, there were lots of infrastructural, economic, and social changes that had taken place in Bilbao for 20 years before this, and lots of investment by the city in many of these projects. And at the end of which, in a sense, came, I mean, it isn't the end of development, but at the end of which came this building to which was a remarkable monument in the city. But the reason you know that it can't just be that building is because all over the place, people hire Geary or other people to sort of do that again, and it never works. It never works because it can't just work on its own. You know, the High Line is a very interesting discussion for me because to come back to New York and have people talk about the High Line effect. So, of course, I grew up not far from there, but the really important point of this was when I started as an art critic, there were these just kind of pioneering places in Chelsea, which was hardly called Chelsea, I don't even think, in the early 90s. And I remember Larry Gagosian had a place on 23rd Street, a little gallery, where he did a couple of nice things. It was like, that's crazy. No one's ever going to go there. So what happened, because of rents in Soho and, other changes elsewhere in the city, people did gravitate there. Galleries changed, people started to move in, developers started to buy something. And then the High Line opened. And suddenly everyone says, wow, the High Line has produced billions of dollars of development and all these people wandering through. It's just incredible. And it's like an amnesiac society. I mean, the High Line is fantastic. And of course, it's done all sorts of things, and it's a great model. But, Jim Corner will tell you, people constantly calling him up and saying, can we renovate this disused rail line, and is it going to, do for us what's happening in Chelsea? And the answer is, of course not. It's crazy.
Yes.
What I was trying to say...
Actually, can we just take a question from someone who hasn't spoken yet?
I liked how both of you talked about engagement, whether it's listening to ordinary people or engaging the forces of which architecture is really just a byproduct, right? Like architecture is the honeycomb. Most people care about the bees. But to take it back to Villa Verde, I was just reading that the for sale units are less than 50% sold, and similarly, Richard Meyer's Prospect Park building is still not 100% sold.
Which is 50% sold?
The for sale units, there's 75 for sale units. I think 40 of them are still for sale. Richard Meyer's building in Brooklyn is not fully sold, and I think there's still this fear of outside buyers to venture into Prospect Park or the South Bronx. So I was wondering if maybe it is an incomplete engagement, because it's still, to some extent, if you build it, they will come. Like you could have engaged people in the community, targeted them, see who could afford a unit, and sold the units to the community members. But the building just gets put up, and you wait for whoever can afford it and reads about it to buy it.
I mean, that's interesting that it's, if it's, I didn't realize that they're not sold. And are you quite sure of that number? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if it's really not as that sold, because there were a lot of applicants, quite a lot of applicants. And, obviously, when I was talking about affordable housing and you're trying to get home ownership in areas like this, you're trying to attract people to this neighborhood within a price point. Generally, here, working class, or in this case, the model that they always had in mind were, families in which a policeman's family, or a fireman's family, something like this, where they could afford a certain house. Maybe they couldn't afford as nice an apartment or home in another neighborhood, but they could step down here and they could afford this. I agree with you, though, that so I'm surprised that it's not more so, but I agree with you completely that it's what I meant when I said to Amanda at the end, it's not just about housing, of course. You can't just build a building and people are going to come into it. You have to have a community. And, one of the first things that struck me coming back to New York and starting to do this job was how incredibly Byzantine, disconnected New York planning and construction and zoning and everything is, so that you can go through the process to build a building, but you can't make sure that there is, let's say, a supermarket in the neighborhood or a school. And the different entities in charge of these things don't necessarily work together. In fact, often they work at odds to each other. You know, the supermarket's a very good example. A lot of that housing there in the South Bronx is wonderful, but there are very few supermarkets in neighborhoods like this because the price, the profit margin for a supermarket is very, very narrow, and most of the big chains don't want to go into poor neighborhoods where they feel they just won't make as much money or maybe any money. So you go into these neighborhoods and they may not have things like fresh produce so I think that you're absolutely right that it's a complicated calculus to find ways in which you can, it's not just about price point, it's about a whole network of demands that need to be met. But that said, I have little faith in, I do have faith in Villa Verde, and I do partly because it's located close to a commercial strip, and it's near a transit hub, so I would imagine that it will begin to, I just feel like this area is, once people get over the stigma of the South Bronx, that there's reason to believe that this was a good investment.
Yes.
I was wondering how your critical direction of moving towards a broader community-oriented focus on architecture relates to the general or maybe emerging direction in contemporary architecture today of moving away from buildings as self-contained art objects to more emphasis on things like designs that are driven by a program or diagrams and interest in issues such as infrastructure and networks and issues like food and climate.
It's to you about your
talking.
budget,
Yes.
yes.
Sure. There's things that interest me, but I suspect that, I don't exist in a vacuum either. So I suspect that that the same reasons that I'm interested in these things are the reasons that the field has moved this way. Obviously, there are economic reasons and a certain exhaustion of conversation, perhaps, that has propelled this elsewhere. But for me, I can only say that as I've said now several times, that it seems to me both a responsibility and an opportunity. I also think as a writer, you should write about what it is that you actually care about. There are obviously things that I have to do in this job and will have to do that may not be my first passion. But just a few months before I started this job, I read a long piece about Peter Zumthor. If there's a pure aesthetic architect, I don't know who that would be. As I said, I think it depends on the case. And I'm sure that within the architectural community, it's also not this sudden, complete, shift. I just think it's a natural opening up of the conversation too.
Let me just add one thing to that, and we'll take one more question. But I think you're defining and you're responding to an important new way of thinking about innovation. That innovation for a long time has been innovative, radical new forms. And I think there is emerging, and we see this a lot here from many of the students, there is an emerging sense of caring about environmental issues, caring about issues of sustainability in terms of natural environments, thinking about urban farming, thinking about reuse of materials, which I had started to show the little piece about. Those are challenges to the faculty, they're challenges to the profession, they're challenges to the little bit we have in the way of magazines. And so there is often a tendency to speak about innovation as if we all agreed on what innovation was, and that then becomes the innovative form. And in fact, the reality is what you're describing. A lot of new ideas, it's still not clear which ones of them will really pulsate and become major new forms for the next 10 years, but certainly they're among the ones you're raising.
Yeah, and there is a natural, students and young people, this is a creative profession. They're going to want to do, if everybody's been zagging, they're going to zig. It's the job of a student to do that, and of schools to encourage it. I mean, it happens not just architecture, it happens in every field. So, I mean, I think there are all sorts of issues out there that essentially play off against what became the trope of the architect, culture. I think temporary thing. I mean, it's very interesting, this idea of group work, temporary work, public space, all the, the sort of the areas between the buildings, all this kind of stuff. In a way, it's the zagging when everyone's been zigging, but it's just part of the natural creative process. I think it's healthy.
Let's take one more question. Yes.
If we're talking about audience today, I guess, and ways of engaging different audiences or merging sort of separate audiences, I was wondering, thinking about your work, and I really appreciate you've said trying to reframe the discussion and broaden it to different topics that you think need to be spoken about. And I'm really impressed by the reception of not only Via Verde, but I'm thinking of the Penn Station article you wrote, and the really positive reception that's gotten. And I think a lot of people are talking about that maybe wouldn't have talked about it before. But I'm wondering about, in my experience, I think people are less, or some audiences are less attracted to the Times architecture columns due to a sense of removal, or there's a delay, and these stories are of such a broad scope that it's not really ever about what's happening for people, what people are really talking about on the street at the moment. And I'm curious why the reaction, and it's not just you obviously, but the reaction always seems to be, let's go to Twitter, let's go to a blog, but there's a lot that's in between those things, something maybe along the lines or scale of the History Detectives, where it's focused stories that are, I mean, this isn't exactly like timely, but something, I'm thinking about the Times' coverage of the AIDS Memorial Park proposals, and what happens to these stories that are time sensitive, and maybe a month or two they develop and it's not long enough for you to do the research that's required for a feature. But at the same time, what happens to these stories and their coverage in the Times is they get blogged about by other people, and you don't get to give them the focus that the chief architecture critic can only give. So I'm just curious if there's something at the Times specifically, or in general, if both of you could comment on a scale of reporting or commenting that's somewhere in between Twitter and a 5,000-10,000 word piece feature.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say in my own case, let me respond to that a few ways. I take your point, which is true. I will say that in the art world there was always this pressure to sort of be exactly where the conversation was within the community, because the art world was a much tighter knit thing. And there was this, and it's so much about what's new. And I sort of hated this pressure because I wasn't sure that it was interesting to anybody. It seemed like I was greasing the wheels of a machine that was not interesting in the first place to me. But I think your point about the disconnect between what's happening sort of in the field and what's Via Verde was not news, I'm sure, to people who. This is something I need to address, and I'm just getting up to speed. I've been doing this for 4.5 months, 5 months, and maybe there's a way to, in my own case, to do things quicker or find this space you're describing in between. And I think it's very important. The AIDS Memorial is a good example. It's an organization thing, but I will say the Times does have it does have lots of people covering the city and other areas, so I'm not alone, and I welcome as much as possible. We have lots of people covering on the Metro desk and so forth. And I wouldn't mind if there were more people who just were devoted to writing about architectural reporting, but that's a resource question. I don't know the answer to it, but I think you raise a very good point.
And it is hard to try to find those vehicles, in part because I think the conversations tend to go viral. You'll have 100 people making comments which are saying the same thing. Yes, 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 I agree. So you don't want to keep going down it because it seems to be less interesting. It's hard. I think we will find in the next year or so ways in which these new media begin to generate more focused kinds of discussions. And the issue that you're raising is exactly the way that has to happen, how to take up things in which you notice something and you write a little comment that night, and there can start to be a conversation. I think we need to be careful not to believe the potential for it means it's happened, because right now the frustration on the one hand of the level of the conversation and of being overwhelmed. I think anybody here must have the same sense that I do. I can't possibly begin to follow all the things that I'm trying to read already. But hopefully that will then sort itself out and there will be a kind of discussion, and I think you will certainly play a major role in it. On that basis, for those of you who might have forgotten that Michael mentioned he is giving a talk tomorrow night. At what time? Oh, you don't know.
6 at Barnard across the street.
6
so
o'clock at
anybody
Barnard.
who goes gets one of these "I endured 2 Michael Kimmelman nights in a row" buttons. No, it's a talk about. It sounds like an interesting series. It's a prepared talk about. It's a series over there about the public good, and Diane Ravitch did something on education, and so it's in different disciplines. So I'm talking about public space, public consciousness. I mean, along the lines of what I've been.
And I feel
so
sure
thank you for that.
He will mention the AIDS Memorial, and so we will have a larger discussion. Thank you for starting that up, and thank you all for coming.